Hi, my name is Evelyn Ullyott, and my research is a quantitative analysis of representation of women's history in Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada recognitions of national historic importance between 2010 and 2024. This research is essentially based on the question of what is considered important to the mainstream idea of Canadian history. And the Historic Sites and Monument Board of Canada, or HSMBC, is part of Parks Canada, which is the federal government's agency that awards national historic status. And this is awarded in three categories: people, places, and events. And this work is a continuation of an analysis that was done by a Parks Canada historian named Diane Dodd in 2009, which was the 90th anniversary of the HSMBC's foundation in 1919. And Dodd found that in the entire 90-year history of HSMBC at that point, 6% of all of the designations given were related to women's history. She did find an increase in the 20th century, at the latter part of the 20th century. In the 1990s, for that decade, 12.2% of all designations were related to women's history. And between 2000 and 2008, 18.6% of all designations were related to women's history. My research is a continuation of what she did for the 15-year time period since she was published in 2009. So I took a look at all of the designations given by the HSMBC between 2010 and 2024. They can be searched on the HSMBC website and filtered by year that the designation was awarded. So I calculated how many of all those designations were individual women or were sites or events that mainly concerned or involved women. And I found that in that time period, there were 255 designations given total, of which 46 were related to women's history, which represents 18% of the total, or slightly less than 1 in 5. What that means is that in the second part of the 21st century, since Dodd's analysis in 2009, there's been a decrease of 0.6% of the total number of designations that are related to women. There were also 4 years during that time span in which no designations were given to women's history: 2013, 2015, 2019, and 2020. There's also a very clear tendency for women's history to be represented as national historic people rather than in national historic places or events designations. Of those designations given in this time frame that I looked at, 69.6% were national historic people who are individual women, rather than national historic places or events that mainly concerned women. And there's no clear reason for this. One possibility is there's a strong popular preference for viewing Canadian history through a military lens and a preference for military history, which is in part due to Canada's status as a settler colonial project. And a lot of the history of Canada is based on armed suppression of Indigenous peoples. A lot of the events that are considered important to this narrative are battles and military conflicts, and a lot of the sites that are relevant to this history are forts and military bases and places where battles occurred. And for a lot of history, women were excluded from military positions. Women weren't involved in things like battles. Women didn't necessarily live in places like forts or frequent them. So women's history can be unrepresented if that's the narrative that is being considered. However, there is more possibility for individual women to involve themselves in narratives of war and military history. One very famous example from Canadians' women's history is Laura Secord. So individual women can pop up more in that narrative. And what I found, and what I concluded based on the numbers that I found, was that women's history is still underrepresented of the total number of designations that the HSMBC gives, and that Parks Canada and the HSMBC are part of an organization and are part of an institution that fosters an image of Canadian history based on nationalism and based in a settler colonial context, and that can prioritize histories and identities descended from the British Empire and descended from the colonial project, which upholds and constructs ideas of Canadian national identity and history that is based on white male settlers. And that other narratives are unrepresented in the mainstream idea of Canadian history at this point.